Thank you, everyone, to be here with us. We are going to embark this exciting panel discussion. So just to briefly introduce our panels set up today, the first block we would like to talk about what are the type of the dream we should have for the next stage of development. And in the second block, how can we make that dream more realistic? Do we have the tools yet, or how should we make our current existing tools or paths more viable, more feasible, more accessible to everyone? So without further ado, let me first introduce the first block of our panel discussion. So we would like to start with the ends, really. So meaning we would like to discuss what is the right development goal and the right metrics of monitoring to see if we, or as a society, are on a good track to get there. Without too much explanation, I think the first question is very simple. So our current paradigm very often focuses on economic pursuits. So the key KPI for societies would be the GDP per capita. And do you see the problem in that? And why would it be not a sufficient metric to monitor our progress? Please feel free, whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to go.
Please.
Okay. So thank you, Isabelle. And first of all, thank you to Asia Society Switzerland for inviting me. And more importantly, congratulations to this cohort of Gen A for graduating. I can already see, based on what I've heard today, that you are an excellent cohort. So congratulations to all of you. So to your question. And maybe I just have one slide. And maybe you can just, I've done a bit of a play on Gen A, as you can see here, to answer your question. So if you can just fly in the G, which is about the GDP measure. And frankly, in my view, this is an anachronism. This will not come to you as a surprise. This is a concept which is 90 years old. It's a concept which was, in a way, made popular by John Maynard Keynes. It was a concept of World War II, which was a concept which was valid during a war situation. None of that applies to us today. But more importantly, the GDP measure is extremely partial. And let me give you three very good reasons why I think it doesn't work today. Firstly, the GDP measure is essentially an aggregate of looking at goods and services in an economy over a certain period. What we don't measure is obviously the positive or the negative externalities of essentially this production. We measure the cars which are being produced, but we don't measure the emissions which have an adverse negative externality on the economy. So that's one reason. The other reason is the GDP measure is clearly it has nothing to do with inclusivity. There can be two countries who may have the same GDP per capita, but one economy might be very egalitarian and the other one may have inequalities which are extreme. And that's why it doesn't work in today's world. And finally, I would say that GDP per capita is focusing on production, whereas as all you young people know in today's fourth industrial revolution, real value is created through the internet, through information technology. And you cannot assign a value to the richness of the internet. So how can you use GDP as a measure is something, personally, I think it is an anachronism. And then I just want to say, because so much is said about the GNH, I think it's important to embrace whatever new development model or paradigm we're talking about. The reason why the GNH was successful is simply because the Bhutanese, from the king to the driver, from the homemaker to the farmer, embraced this concept and understood that just income or economic perspectives alone cannot be responsible for their happiness. And that is, I think, whatever development model we want to think about for the future has to embrace, the people of the country have to embrace that. And then if you look at the end, and this is something which I think is crucial. People say it's not possible to go beyond the economic measure for progress, for development. And I think we should never say not possible. The fact of the matter is that the already the Human Development Index was defined more than 30 years ago. The fact of the matter is that today, whether it's Sweden or Slovenia or Costa Rica or New Zealand, they are all measuring the well-being of their people and not by GDP per capita. The reality is that there is a happiness minister in UAE. The reality is that International Happiness Day is a UN International Day on March 20th every year. The reality is that since 2012, there is a World Happiness Report, which is sponsored by the UN, where Switzerland, by the way, is ranked third this year. So clearly, there is a push towards going beyond GDP and talking about quality of life and talking about well-being. So we should never say that this is not possible. And finally, I want to talk a bit about the SDGs, because some of you have mentioned this. We do have a framework which allows us to think beyond GDP, and that is indeed the 17 goals of the SDGs, which brings the economic, social, and the environmental pillar together and launches an international agenda for development, which goes beyond just looking at GDP per capita. So I think we need to see how we can align with the SDG framework. The difficulty is that there are 17 goals, there are 169 targets, there are 231 indicators. So that's a monster. And we have to see how we can deconstruct this SDG framework in a way which allows us actually to go in a very pragmatic way into this discussion around the new development paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very elaborative narrative already. And I think we already see that GDP itself, or GDP per capita, is not really covering all these dimensions we care for the whole population. But also all these alternative indicators that brings measurement feasibility issues. So for the other three panelists, what do you think that how should we incorporate such a diverse universe of new indicators? And yes, please.
Well, I think it is easy to conclude and relatively easy to agree that GDP is a thing of the past. We just have to find ways, as you say, how to implement it. And I think we have to go a step higher and not lower. For me, looking just at the SDGs is kind of going a step lower and trying to fiddle with little characteristics and try to implement those little characteristics into our current system. I think we will never succeed. I think what I feel sorry about the current discussion on how to use sustainability in everyday life, I think it will go down in a big marketing effort of the large corporations and end there. We have to find ways, at least in our head, and then maybe in the larger discussions on raise the issue a little bit higher. What do we try to achieve? Do we try to be a good civilization, for example, and do we try to augment ourselves as a good civilization? And where do we stand if we now externalize and look at the planet from the outside? And then all of a sudden we come to a worldview where we have to say, we have to learn how to use all the resources of the planet up to almost 100%, but it should not explode. So if you look at the current state of affairs, maybe we use 50% of the resources of the planet, and most of the resources we don't use yet. So we are beginners, but nevertheless, we have no clue on how to reach a point where we use even more and keep it all in a circular environment. And I think that is the goal. And in order to achieve that, we will have to work on how a society operates. We will have to think about changing the basic laws. We have to think about changing the basic mindset. It's not, I make more money than you. And it's not me as a nation, we have a better GDP per capita than the other ones. We have to find commonalities. And these commonalities have to be found, I think, in a bigger world.
So the message is also very critical. In terms of pursuing a better path, we should be the owner of the action instead of letting other stakeholders taking the lead. Would you two also have something to add here?
Yes. I think the great thing about GDP has been that it's such a successful concept. It has been believed in for almost a century, and it has legitimized politics, development politics. So it has been a performative concept in a way. And I think that gross happiness, the gross happiness index and well-being indexes that exist are not there yet. They're not as established as the other one. And I think the dangers and mean thing about the GDP is that it excludes so much and devalorizes a lot of activities. For instance, I did research in Sumatra and in West Papua, in remote areas where people hardly had any money, but were very well fed because they had a strong subsistence economy. Apart, they also produced for the market. But because they had so little income, because they fed themselves and were healthy, they were considered to be backwards. And they needed to be developed. So the Indonesian government puts a lot of effort into developing these areas. So, but a measure like gross national happiness would perhaps done more justice to the state of affairs of these people. So they perhaps would not have been drawn into this direction where they could, not maintain their way of life, but they were like forced into mainstream development without having a choice. That's. I think we also should reflect on these other measures, like gross national happiness. Could it not be also that happiness can be unequally distributed, just as income can be unequally distributed? So gross national happiness would just gloss over differences. So I think we certainly have to define happiness not as an individual state, not as a psychological state, but as a state of a society, probably,
So more as a collective term, yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Tran, please.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Happy to join the panels. I agree with most has been said, but I would like to bring things in a practical kind of, what exactly we can do, and then it nailed down to the level of development. When you talk about happiness, sustainability in Switzerland, it would be different, very different from what happened in Bhutan, in Vietnam, in India, somewhere else. Just give you an example. My mom, who joined me in Switzerland, she happy about everything in Switzerland, except what we discussed at the panel before, the waste of food. And the dump of household items still in a good shape in Geneva, Canton every month. So she was not happy, and she decided to go back to Vietnam because she cannot support. She said, people still poor everywhere. Here is the waste. So just give you an example that the concept of development, happiness, and sustainability, it goes to the level of development. And I very agree with the two professors and doctor is at the end you need to kind of what are the common values of the society at that point in time. And things change. Concept of, development 10 years ago, 15 years ago, different from today's. And even the state of happiness of people. Then my second point is about the GDP. I think, a lot have been said. I agree with Ashish, but I also agree with Professor. The GDP, in my view, is still a good indicator in economic terms to consider in any state of development. If you look at the SDG, the GDP per capita is also there. It's a part of the package. And it's still a good indicator for the government and investors to look at it, to decide on, among other things. But it's not the only one, You can look at other indicators. And I don't think we use the word alternative. They are all mutually supporting each other. You look at GDP, you look at GNH, you look at SDG, you look at Human Index Development, and you look at the World Happiness Report. They are only indicators, but it nailed down to the core components of development. Is education, is ecological system, is economic growth, is a good governance. So how government at different states, break down that and prioritize different dimensions depending on different state of development. At the end of the day, it's about prioritization. And how you do it is state-led exercise, or like, World Bank, IMF, or other come to help you to prioritize what you need, or it's a people-led exercise. And that may be another debate about the means. Yes. We all have a dream, and I think, legitimate dream defined by nation, by people, but how to get there, it comes to the means. And maybe I stop there. Thank you.
No, it's actually an excellent point before we start in the second block, but I think the messages are very clear. GDP itself has certain functions, but purely relying on that would be leading us to the wrong ends for definitely the Asian countries as well. And we would like to include more indicators. While these indicators need to be implementable, feasible, and there need to be higher goals to lead a collective society to get there. Sorry, yes?
Maybe one point that I would like to make with regard to Asia and let's say the focus on GDP as a development measure. I think and of course I cannot blame all of these countries kind of looking at GDP as one of the potential measures. But if you purely focus on that, they do run the risk that they get stuck in our famous middle income gap, because as they go along, they might find unhappy people, maybe they get unmotivated, maybe they lose their steam, etc., etc. We've seen it, we've forecasted, etc. To a certain extent, they would need, let's say, spiritual thinking or help in thinking, and I'm sure not all of them can do it like Bhutan, but they need to have new ideas that allow them to leapfrog out of this predicament of just creating, polluting, and whatever it leads to. And the great thing about some of these young nations could be philosophical leapfrogging and creation of new ideas. And of course, most of them still do it the Korean way, the Vietnamese way. You are very, very, very industrial and industrious people. They work hard and they muscle themselves out of that poverty predicament, let's put it. I don't think all of them can do it. I don't think, I love the Philippines, but I'm kind of hesitant to believe they can do that just by working hard. They have to get new ideas. India might need to get new ideas. China still might need to get new ideas, because they still all can get stuck. So for me, it's worth to think about new ways of getting them to a, let's say, national and then maybe continental happiness level, where they see a future where they keep the young generation that is so important to keep the engine going, to keep the young generation motivated in that track, and not lose them to the West or to the US or to wherever, where all the talents seem to be rushing to. Maybe they need to have their own visions and their own goals, and they probably will differ a little bit from the GDP measure, and they probably will differ a little bit from the goals of the Communist Party. We probably need to show them something else.
Something very innovative, a big dream for the Asian countries to carry ahead. Actually, that's a perfect opening to the next part of our discussion. So if we want to create innovative and good dreams, how can we do that? Do we take a tea before that? Or do we have the old elements that are actually helping it? For example, trade, for example, development aid. And if we do see all the actions going on in Asia, or the big FDIs flowing into Asia, creating the industrial complex there, how can we make sure it's inclusive growth? Now I'm actually putting all the elements into this second block of our panel discussion, but please feel free to pick up any type of the element I have mentioned or anything else that you think that matters more. Please.
Yeah. Yeah, the way you introduced the question of development, I mean, also already indicated a bit that development is often thought as a top-down politics.
Yes.
And I think that actually, you mentioned it, yeah? That there's also a lot of development going on the grassroots level. People having ideas, people being ambitious. So I think people should also, local people should be given the chance to have their own visions of development fulfilled. I'm doing my research in Indonesia, as I mentioned, and for small farmers, for instance, it's very hard to develop because hardly any of them have land rights. So they're not in a strong position concerning their property. They can be pushed away by a big plantation company, for instance. So they're also not creditworthy. Who will lend money to a farmer who has no security? So I think that there are already legal requirements for bottom-up development. And I think that would be really important. People are incredibly ambitious and work very hard if they see a chance of fulfilling their life dreams. Most people, small farmers in Indonesia, they have the ambition to put their children through school and university, and many of them achieve that, as long as they have the opportunity to have their own business. But for instance, if their land is taken by some big plantation company, of course, all they can aspire to is getting a job at the plantation, and they can't develop their own potential in this way. So I think it's really very important to see development as an inclusive process, as a process that is distributed, that is also democratically governed, so that people really can develop their potential and get away from these top-down measures. I think it's very easy, for instance, to invest money in a country in Asia through the big companies and through the government, not through the small farmers. That's pretty hard work to achieve that. It's possible. It would be possible. Smart finance on the grassroots level, that would be a great project, I think. So I think we should also be more imaginative and look for partnerships also with grassroots people, and also look, also try to influence the political structure in a way and encourage democratic development.
So you actually touched both on, in terms of development aid and foreign direct investments, whether it's from a public sector dominated or led program, or it's from a corporate initiative. There are both ways to empower local communities to incorporate their own ambition and make it possible for local population to find a way to develop in their own wish. And with that, Ms. Tran, do you have something to add also in terms of the trade developments?
Yes. So we touch upon the questions of empowering people at the grassroots level. And specific to Asian society, I don't know if you've traveled there or whatever, but growing up there, I can say that, people there are born with entrepreneurships and innovative mindset through different, hardship of life from the world to where we are now. But we need to kind of, there's three conditions, put it that way. And you mentioned one is the ecosystem, the regulatory framework. And then the second is, the confidence, the capacity of people. Capacity is there, but, whether I'm confident enough in kind of, get into the joint venture. And third one, want it or not, is still the capital. If you want to do something. And that exactly on the trade side, like the program like us, we are trying to work, with the grassroots level in order to empower them, to help them to, one is, doing better in what they are doing in terms of production, increase productivities, and get access to international market. And by having more exposure to different environments that they can learn, and that it touches upon the question of learning by doing as well. If you don't see new thing, big thing, then you stay in your small box and you never get out of the box. But there, I also observe in Asian, at least Vietnam, like country I grew up, is that's two kind of like quote unquote innovations, big innovations, frontier technology. There, and then the second one is like a little step innovation in small stuff that you are doing. Like, I need to do working on like, like in my family has a coffee farm. So I used to pick up the coffee in the farm, so very labor intensive. And my classmate helped to kind of innovate, like invent a machine that can help to kind of grab the coffee quicker, faster. So it's very easy to do. When I see, very basic concept, you can do it. But we never, with that small innovation, we can never look at, how you use big frontier technology, in that way. And I think that's another discussion that require, I'm not sure if, learning by doing, do it yourself can help, or the role of the government, the state, a big investment. If you look at Silicon Valley, if there's no big investment, whether you have it, you look at back in, the East Asian industrializations, if there's no big push, whether they get there. So be realistic about when you want to do a big dream, big innovations, and then small innovations. But the bottom line, I would like to say, is everything is about people. And I fully agree that we need to empower people, through building capacity, building their knowledge, having ecosystem, and help them to have exposure to different kind of, new ideas. And trade has a role to play. And that's what we try to do, like an inclusive trade, put it that way. Try to work with small and medium enterprises and gender, women, and go to community.
Perfect. Since you mentioned innovation and learning by doing, I already saw Dr. Lustenberger has something to say. Please.
Now, of course, I have to put on my hat as a Chamber of Commerce person. International trade is at the heart of Swiss companies, because we are a small country and we are dependent on doing international trade. And if I look at international trade as such, then if we are lucky as a good side product, it will help to develop people. But in essence, international trade is here to just increase numbers measured by those GDP thinking people, because that's why you do trade. Now, we have just gone through the experience here in Switzerland of having a hard time, really hard time, to conclude a free trade agreement with Indonesia. the topic all of a sudden was palm oil and all its bad side effects, etc., etc. Everyone knows we need palm oil, but nobody wanted to have it in their cakes. And so we muddled the concept of doing free trade with a concept of wishful thinking we can help the palm oil plantations to become more sustainable. It will not, through these measures, become more sustainable. It's kind of like kicking the back but meaning the donkey. You know, you kind of try to implement a concept but in a entirely wrong field. So for me, if I look at me as a person, as a chairman of a Chamber of Commerce, I am all pro, and as a chairman of a Chamber of Commerce in Switzerland, I must be all pro international trade. I must be all pro global trade. It has its bad side effects that we can try to deal with, but if we go down to what is happening now, mainly that some trading clubs start to become exclusive, meaning excluding others. Our State Secretary just came back from the US, where she was asked to be one of the US's friends. That's fine for Switzerland to be one of the US's friends, but if the Philippines are asked to be one of the US's friends and not China's friends, in parentheses, or if Vietnam is being asked to do that, it becomes trickier, because to be a friend means you deal with me, you don't deal with the other guy. And then all of a sudden, international trade becomes a completely new animal, and the side effects that we see, that we may think, why should I have coffee from, let's say, Bhutan, available for me here for 20 cents. Why shouldn't I drink coffee from, let's say, Northern Africa, that is nearby? It's one of the side effects of international trade that goods travel crisscross the world and it doesn't all make sense. But I am sure if we believe in capitalism, capitalism will try to smooth it out, the inefficiencies of these trades. And if we start to implement, for example, measures that on a balance sheet you also have to account for the damages that you do, then all of a sudden this will smooth itself out. There are other ways than to stop international trade. So in my eyes, trade, I'm a big pro-trade believer. Switzerland must be a big pro-trade believer. And I think if we find ways to account for some of the bad sides of bad trade, of international trade, then we get the right way. And then maybe one final comment to Professor Znoj. I believe individual ownership is one of the key things. But of course, individual ownership is the key ingredient of our societies here, because we have learned that if something is a common good, then everyone just tramples around it and nobody cares for it and looks after it. Whereas if it is individually owned, then you put a fence around it and you properly take care of it. And that can lead to a lot of progress. Still, I believe we should work on philosophical concepts that go beyond individual ownership. I don't have the recipe, but I think we are shortchanging ourselves if we say individual ownership is the only ingredient that will make everyone happy.
Thanks. Thanks for asking me this question, throwing me this ball, because well, of course, these societies used to be very happy with common property resources. But if you live next to a plantation and you only have common property, which your government doesn't acknowledge as property, then you need to have private property of this land, because otherwise it will be taken away from you. And that's what's happening in Indonesia a lot. And I'm also, I must admit that I was one of those who made your life hard concerning the trade agreement, because I was very vocal, an opponent against this agreement, because of not only of palm oil, but mainly of palm oil, because this is really the kind of authoritarian development that is happening in Indonesia that really drives a lot of people out of their land, especially indigenous people in West Papua, which is a terrible thing. And with this trade agreement, we silently acknowledge that this is okay. It's helping the trade. And I think we should draw a line and say, no, we have a moral duty also to bring about a development that is not so much in favor of the big companies, but really try to take care of tribal people, small farmers, and give them a chance. So this is, I'm afraid, this is not what has been in the foreground in the trade agreement that Switzerland concluded with Indonesia. But I'm very happy that the result was so narrow, so that probably future trade agreements will be more careful and place more weight on human rights and good governance.
Thank you. Dr. Shah, do you have something to add, please?
Well, I can't say much because I'm coming in last and I think everything has been said. But perhaps, 2 or 3 points. Let me start by maybe starting with the end goal, because that was the first block. And the end goal, I think we all agree, is really about having or ensuring that we have an equitable and just society, which obviously is thriving economically, but not compromising on the quality of life. And our challenge is to be able to understand how to bring about this society, and then to the second block of questions which you have asked, how do we actually do that? I think if we believe that that is the end goal, clearly we need to make sure that national policies, resources, aid flows, trade flows, human capital are all aligned towards that end goal. And right now, as you have just heard, this is not the case. So if you look at aid flows are essentially, in my view, although I work for a UN organization, I think aid flows are very short-sighted. Firstly, they are not neutral. Aid often comes with strings attached. It comes with a world vision, which is often a Western world vision of what is good for development. Aid is often focused on short-term results, whereas what we are looking for are long-term impacts. So I don't think that the current paradigm of the way aid is provided is right. So I do want to, in a way, plead for aid which is more directed towards inclusive trade. And I think you have all spoken about inclusive trade in different ways. So not just international trade. You, as a chair of a Chamber of Commerce, have to be pro-international trade, but you have also qualified that by saying, and you have said this, Professor Znoj, it has to be trade which is inclusive. And for me, inclusive trade means to be able to work with the bottom of the pyramid. So we at ITC, where I work, we have programs which are directly where we work with women entrepreneurs, where we work with displaced people, where we empower youth. And by doing that, and by including these people in international value chains, we are being able to have a direct impact on all the SDGs, whether it's the SDG on gender, the SDG related to youth, whether it's poverty alleviation. All the different SDGs are being addressed if you understand that trade has to be inclusive and trade has to be sustainable. And if you can just put up that second slide, because if I speak about Gen A and I don't speak about Asia Society, the A and the S, I think the chairperson of Asia Society there will not be very happy. So I have a second slide there where I want to speak to the A and to the S very, very quickly. And if the slide is not coming on, it's fine. The A is for... The A is for aid for inclusive trade, which I have just spoken about. And let's not forget that inclusive trade should not just be something... I think people speak about it very loosely, but inclusive trade means firstly being inclusive within the country so that the bottom of the pyramid can benefit from trade, but inclusive trade also means that the least developed countries and the developing countries are actually benefiting more from trade than perhaps the developed countries to bring about greater inclusiveness. And that can be done. So I can give you just, I mean, when we work with cocoa farmers in Ghana, we are not working with them just so that they export their cocoa to Switzerland, to Nestle. We are now helping them to add value to their cocoa and make the chocolates which are made by Mondelez in Zurich or by Nestle, so that they are capturing a greater value of the cocoa in their own countries. And for me, that's what inclusive trade is about. Or helping a coffee farmer.
You have to turn off airplane mode.
So, yeah. And just to finish, helping a coffee farmer to move his or her coffee directly to the table of a consumer in the UK using e-commerce as a platform, so we don't have all these middlemen capturing the value sitting all across the world. That is what inclusive trade is about. So for the A, if you can just fly it in now, is about aid for inclusive trade. And the S, and I will finish with that, if you could just, and this has been spoken about, trade has to be both sustainable and inclusive. So we've spoken a lot about inclusivity, we've spoken less about sustainability, but I think there are ways of actually doing this. You are all members of Gen A, so maybe you know this, but I was very impressed by the Sustainable Trade Index of the Heinrich Foundation based in Singapore. So they actually have an index on the basis of which 19 Asian countries are being compared around 3 sets of indicators: social indicators, economic indicators, and environmental indicators. So do look up the I don't work for Heinrich Foundation, but I was very impressed because they have, for the economic pillar, they have a set of 15 indicators, which includes GDP, but which also includes FDI. For the social indicators, they look at the Gini coefficient, they look at tertiary education. For the environmental pillar, they're looking at water pollution, they're looking at deforestation. So in a way, they are looking at how to make sure that trade is inclusive and sustainable, and they're doing this in a very scientific way. And they have prepared this index, which is not by no means a Rolls Royce, but I think it provides a good basis to take the discussion forward on how to measure development in a manner where we can compare across economies and countries.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shah. I think we are at a perfect concluding moment. I think now we have about 10 to 8 minutes to open the floor for Q&A. So please, everyone on site, I think there are some questions there, please.
Thank you for your talk. I have one. Is it working? I have one question. Okay, yeah. I look mostly at Southeast Asia, and especially during this pandemic, there's a general trend towards more authoritarian governments in the region. And so how do you see the link between political systems and a trend towards sustainability in general? Is this a block, so a hindrance towards a more sustainable and inclusive development in the region, or how do you see this in the future going forward, seeing this political development overall?
I think
You go.
Yeah. Just to give you an example. In Indonesia, the pandemic had a devastating effect. First of all, tourism broke away, and then investors stopped investing in Indonesia. So the reaction of the government was to introduce new laws that lowered the labor rights standards and that lowered environmental standards. And the government could do that because the government is very strong. So it's authoritarian. You have a lot of military personnel in the ministries who also own a lot of resources, land, coal mines, and so on. So they, in order to further their vision of development, they just made Indonesia a little bit or a lot more authoritarian. And they took the excuse of the pandemic. So this is really a very worrying development. And I think that, this is a development that is like a vicious circle. The more powerful the elite becomes, the more dominant it also becomes in the economy. So they become a kind of oligarchs, and to break that again and give more rights to the people is really very, very difficult. And I think here the role of international trade could play a role. And trade partners have a certain weight. They can influence their trade partners, but they mostly like to keep the economy and politics separate, which is a pity.
Dr. Lustenberger, I see you nodding head.
Yeah, well, first of all, to the last discussion, I think a company sitting here, if any corporation sits here, they want to stay out of politics. If you go to China and you try to explain to Xi Jinping he should stop being a communist, then it's your last business that you've done. If you do the same with Mr. Modi in India, last time you were there. So companies will try to stay out of that as long as they can. Sometimes they have to show face, but they will. I tell you, best advice is not to meddle in politics if you're a company, because there are so many things that could happen. You know, there could be changes in who is the leader next year, and if you have subscribed to the previous leader, all of a sudden you're on the wrong side, etc. You don't want to do that. The other thing, back to the question, I think, in fact, what has happened in Southeast Asia and probably all over the world is the pandemic has given certain strong people the right to use emergency measures. We, in Switzerland, we had similar emergency measures, or maybe we worried that our leadership wasn't even strong enough to implement really strong emergency measures. And now we see that leadership is not strong enough because of all the squabbling of the anti-vaxxers and the vaxxers, etc. But this squabbling that we see now is kind of an expression of the maturity of our process. We can squabble with them and whatever. In the end, we will find back to a normal rule of law like we had it before the pandemic, I think. In Southeast Asia, in fact, that might not be the case, because it could be that it was an opening for some of the strong people to change the landscape a little bit in their favor, or in favor of some of the people that they like. And the real concern is that it will not change back, and that there is not a, let's say, sufficient dialogue or sufficient strength in the public dialogue to change it back. And what can be observed in Southeast Asia is that under the pandemic, when no leadership came, the poor people suffered the most, because it was devastating for the poor people, the rate of infection. And then when the measures came, the poor people again suffered the most, because they couldn't even go out of their homes to get their food. So it it will be, for a future crisis, it will take a huge exercise for, let's say, the international bodies to try to think ahead what emergency measures should be taken or could be taken in countries that are relatively poor. Because if you just make a lockdown in the Philippines and nobody can go out of their barangays to look for food, they will not have any food there. And the people will literally starve. And when then the people go out and they face somebody at gunpoint sending them back, it's not fun for them. Whereas for us, when we have a lockdown, we have a sufficiently stocked refrigerator and we kind of sit there and eat for a week, and we send somebody out or call somebody to deliver food. So for us, a lockdown as we have seen it is difficult, but it's not a question of survival. There it is often a question of survival. And that, to me, was one of the episodes that struck me the most, how in these countries, the poor people, they didn't have somebody that was talking for them. And that we will have to change. And whether we can change that, the strongmen will return to a normal or free or whatever, less strong or less dictatorial mode, that is something that will be seen. And whether international trade can play a role, maybe, but only indirectly, I think.
Mr. Tran, I think you wanted to add something?
Yeah, maybe I bring a bit of Asian insight into the debate. I mean, if you observe, yes, historically and different, regions, there's a strong government role in the Southeast Asian society. Maybe it's back to, in the late 20th century with developmental states, where state played a key role in, even in South Asia, in East Asia. And that culture, when I was young and even in Vietnam, we accept the fact that the government has a strong role and we listen, that's part of our culture. But I think things change. I remember with the Vietnam accession to the WTO, first time, then in the law we know that, okay, now a new law to be published, we need to debate about it. And we used to work with different business and community different to create a culture of dialogue. But when they come to dialogue, they don't talk about policy. It's more about, my problem, accessing to finance, so on. But I think I observed the culture of debate, social debate, dialogue, started to grow and taking an important place. And very often, via social media, Facebook, we debate about different things. During the lockdown, at the beginning, it was chaotic for everybody. People could not get out. But, someone posted in the Facebook, immediately the community helped. And then later on, the army came, to deliver food. But I think the culture of dialogue, the culture of social debate, it needs to be cultivated, put it that way, in the class, in the education system. Vietnam, like other China, South Asia, Southeast Asia, you are in the class, you listen to teachers, everything teachers say is correct, you never debate. So, and you listen, and then we are also rooted in Confucius culture. Like, you follow the example of your boss, of your teacher. So this kind of, culture, it needs to be kind of, I should not say change, but, people exposed to different democracy and then things taking place, but it would take time. But I would say through the internet, back to your question, sorry, a few seconds more. International trade, like what we are doing now, I mentioned the example of the WTO. You need to debate about the new law before you can endorse it. It's one thing about, international collaboration, bringing in the good practices, the pressures, but also linked to aid for trade that you mentioned. Actually, we do much more than promoting trade. as part of what we are doing now is, to help least developed countries to put in place, the dialogue mechanisms between the government and the private sectors, between the government and the development partners. So policy priority, making would be more evidence-based and more comprehensive, taking into account different dimensions, not only economic focus. And the last point here is, on that aid for trade or aid for inclusive trade. I think it can have like a long-term impacts and sustainability oriented if, really it should be like, people driven, country driven, and country driven mean also that you need to bring people on the table and, discuss together to shape the priorities. So I think that's what I want to bring in a bit on the debate culture.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we are perfectly running out of time, maybe for just 1 or 2 minutes. So let me also represent Asia Society to give our distinguished panelists the Swiss gift.